discussions and tools that can really dig into the question, who owes who? In 2015, she published The For-Profit College Scam, Why I Support the Debt Strike Against My Former Employer. She's been on strike and organizing against alongside fellow student strikers, debtors, and members of the debt collective ever since. And finally, we have Pam Hunt. Is Pam here? I know she had some family emergencies, but hopefully she has been able to join us. Pam, let's see if I can
Hi.
Hi, Pam. All right. Good to see you.
Yes, you too. Thank you.
Pam Hunt is a graduate of Everest College and a member of the Debt Collective. Pam was one of the first student debt strikers in 2015 to start applying borrower protections. Pam has won some debt cancellation for herself and many others, but still has 6 figures of student debt and continues to fight for cancellation. And Pam lives in Connecticut. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, panel. And but before we begin, I'm going to first frame our discussion with a few hard facts, hard truths about the student debt crisis and how it is affecting millions of Americans' lives as well as the economy as a whole. So I'm going to share my screen right now and share a quick presentation with you all. Okay, so a lot of the statistics and points are drawn from this. Oops, let me see if I can do this here. Are drawn from the a coronavirus explainer, and a lot of these it's basically a compilation of the facts and statistics of surrounding student debt. The report is called Borrowing from Our Future, the Case for Canceling Student Debt. It is the latest coronavirus dispatch for August 2020 from the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center. The full report, if you are interested, is available at this link that you see on the slide, progressivecaucuscenter.org. So just in a nutshell, over 46 million Americans and their families are burdened with student debt. We say 46 million Americans, but of course, those people are connected to families, and so their finances also affect the finances of everyone around them. So technically, we could say that up to over 100 million people are directly or indirectly affected by student debt. Americans now owe more in student loan debt than they do for auto loans, credit cards, or any other non-mortgage debt. And as you can see from this red line, it has skyrocketed in just the last 18 years or so. Student debt has more than tripled since the 2008 Great Recession, reaching a total of $1.6 trillion nationally, which means that student debt and student and education expenses are not a separate thing from the economy as a whole. In fact, it's moving in the opposite direction. And over 25% of student loan borrowers are behind on their debt payments. That's 1 in 4 with a, as I like to say, involuntary debt strike, right? Now, people think that it's just one generation, the millennials or the Zoomers that are affected by student debt, but actually this is across generations. Generations of burden by student debt affects the wider economy, especially in the areas of home ownership and small business. The Federal Reserve has done many studies that show that rising student debt levels help account for decreasing homeownership and small business formation in particular, especially among young people. That means when people get out of college, they're ready to start their lives. They can't because they struggle to buy a car, buy a house, they delay getting engaged or married or having children. And so basically you're shackled as soon as you are just at that point where you're supposed to start lives. And of course, the COVID-19 crisis has exacerbated everything about this situation. Since the COVID-19 crisis, a staggering 51 million Americans have filed for unemployment insurance. Student loan debt affects a wide spectrum of Americans. So while young people 18 to 24 do make up about a third of student loan holders, an increasing number of older Americans, that's 50 and up, are suffering from student debt burdens. And as you see from this chart, again, it tracks the overall increase in student debt the student debt for older borrowers has increased as well. 29, and this is staggering here, folks, 29% of borrowers from 50 to 64 are in default. 37% of senior borrowers 65 and over are in default. And in 2015, 40,000 older borrowers had their Social Security garnished due to student loan debt. These figures are really, really striking, especially as we are seeing an increasing number of older Americans struggling with healthcare costs and becoming homeless as well. Student debt is especially disproportionately a crisis for Black and Brown borrowers and students of color. These are the figures for the undergraduates with student loan debt. This is from almost actually a decade ago, right? This is from, and here you can see that disproportionately it's in Latino borrowers who take out more debt than their Black students borrow student loans at higher rates and take on thousands more in debt due to a history of exclusionary policies that have resulted in persistent racial inequities in income. And as we will hear from the folks from the Debt Collective, are often targeted by for-profit institutions that line their pockets with taxpayer dollars at students' expense. If you ever still watch broadcast TV in the afternoons, you'll see these student loan commercials that are really, it's pretty crazy. Black and Latinx borrowers are up to 3 times more likely to default on student loans than their white counterparts. And for Black borrowers in particular, full student debt cancellation is really a key thing because it can help ease the unequal burden of housing costs, childcare, and help boost household finances at a time when they are more likely to face unemployment and job loss, eviction, and housing insecurity. So those are just a couple of quick, again, facts and figures on it. So we've seen these numbers, but for many people, even those of us with student debt, the crisis doesn't really hit home unless we hear the stories. I will admit, actually, that I myself am currently in default for my student loans. I'm one of the millions of Americans, especially people of color, who have had to choose between paying my debts or feeding and housing myself, and daily survival wins out every single time. I'd like to start with Pam on this question and then ask each of the panelists to briefly, maybe about 3 minutes or so, describe how they are seeing the effects of the student debt crisis on the ground. How have you seen student debt impact you, people in your community and your work, and why is eliminating student debt important to you? So go ahead, Pam. I'd like to hear from you first. Oops. Oh, are you muted? Uh-oh, I think she's frozen. Pam, are you with us?
Okay.
All right.
Can you hear? Yeah. You went out a few times when you were asking your question, but I think I got the gist of it. And I believe that how it affects me and other people that I know is because of my student debt that I have, I'm unable to purchase a home. So I have to live in but because of my debt to income ratio, because of the student loan, according to the banks and the powers that be that have the money to lend me, I don't I'm not able to afford that. Also, it affects me because I'm not able to get the employment that would allow me to pay off this debt. I mean, I just don't make that kind of money. And it's out making that type of money to get out of this rut. It also means that I can't leave any type of wealth for my kids. And they're not going to be able to leave any type of wealth for their kids. So it's just like this domino effect. And that's one of the reasons why we find ourselves in this type of rut, is because there is no generational wealth within our family, within our community. And so, like you said, we do have to take out loans, the max and the highest percentage rate. And so it just kind of affects me and other people that I know across the board with every aspects of life.
Thank you very much, Pam. One of the things that I have heard you mention, I just want to mention this really briefly because I don't think this is, I mean, this has just happened in the last decade that I've known of, is that you actually, many jobs will actually run your credit when they're considering hiring. And so, when you don't have, if you have bad credit because you have a student loan, that actually hurts your job choices and it just becomes a treadmill and a spiral. So Dawn or Dr. Newfield, would you like to weigh in on how student debt, you've seen student debt affect you and the people around you, and why canceling it is very important to you?
Shall I go, Dawn? I graduated with a PhD with about $5,000 worth of debt, which I was able to pay off with my, assistant professor salaries. And I mention that just because the intergenerational unfairness of this situation is offensive. And, it's my generation, Gen X, Gen Y have had a much easier time, and I don't see the justification for that. One other thing I would say, too, is just watching what has happened to the 30 years of students that I've taught at UCSB. Our Pell Grant share has gone up to about 37%. My department, which is English, which when I first arrived was kind of the white major, is now majority students of color. It's majority working class. What I have seen, in order to manage their student debt while they're still in college, are working too much, and it's affecting their studies. So I've had to assign less reading, not because students today don't like to read as much, but because they simply don't have the same amount of time as my students of the 1990s had to get their work done. So as we indebt students, we are also lowering the educational intensity of their experience while they're in college, in addition to the really very serious problems that Pam has just mentioned for folks once they've actually graduated.
Thank you. Dawn, would you like to speak?
Hi. So I was a former employee, as it was mentioned in the introductions, working in the for-profits. And I just would like to say at the top of this call, we keep trying to separate for-profits and public, and more they're just getting more similar in their toxicity and their predatory practices that leads us into further debt. So I just want to say that. So me personally, I have $180,000 in student debt. Even though I have my master's degree, I went from working in the for-profits, the corporate finance manager of Heald, to working in the restaurants because of my credit and issues like that, not getting jobs. But I want to talk about those that don't normally get mentioned in these kind of panel discussions enough. And that is parent borrowers, that is co-signers, and that's also sorry, I was just on a call yesterday, the private student loan volume as well, because it's not just the federally held loans that are an issue, which is a big issue. It's the private student loans that have emerged. Now, once upon a time, folks thought that you would take out private student loans in addition, like if you're going to graduate, doctorates, whatever. But we have students today going to UCLA undergrad being forced into predatory private student loans. And so an example I want to share that just came up very recently. I get nervous talking about it because some of these stories are so intense. A 17-year-old in California, he's one of our beautiful dreamers, decides to enroll in school at 17, mind you, before he can buy cigarettes, before he can purchase alcohol legally, and he's thrown into whirlwind of debt. His mother, Spanish-speaking mother, was not aware of terms. Here we are in present time day. The mother as a co-signer has been sued on these loans. Her weekly check at a grocery store is being garnished twice a week. This student's loan not only started at $30 a week, for the last 3 years, the loan is currently $49,000. How do you do that math? Where does it come from? So this is a household issue, right? It's not just a borrower issue. It impacts marriage. It impacts will people have kids? As Pam mentioned, it impacts wealth, generating wealth. So we need to start talking about this a little bit broader and not just be so narrow band around the current student debt borrowers, because there's a lot more people. And I just want to highlight, because of the way that we've come to understand debt, we know that there's not going to be the relief that we need to see across the board without a debtors union and without a debt strike. So for myself, I'm exercising my delinquency as a right to go delinquent and fight back against these loans. And we're not going to pay these loans until they're all canceled. We'll get into more of that as we go through. There are hardwired means and ways for this debt to be canceled. But again, we can't just talk about the federal debt and not talk about the private debt too, because it's really, really toxic, y'all. Like, seriously, start looking more into what happens to students with private student loan debt on top of their federal student loan debt. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dawn. And you just put a whole lot in there that tells you the dimensions, again, of this crisis, that it's not just affecting students, it has spillover effects to the entire economy. Thank you so much. So as Dawn mentioned, there are two types of student loans held by borrowers, public and private loans. The majority of these are held, or at least guaranteed, by the federal government. But so the government does have enormous power to cancel these debts, even almost with a stroke of a pen. And we've seen various attempts to enact student debt cancellation through government action. The most powerful initiative we've seen so far, Omar, who in 2019 introduced the Student Debt Cancellation Act, or HR 3448. Representative Omar is one of our biggest champions of student debt cancellation in Congress today, and she's provided us a wonderful statement on this issue. So I'm going to read it to you right now. So this comes from Representative Ilhan Omar. Student debt was a national crisis before the pandemic, and it's an even deeper crisis now. 45 million people are shackled by student debt due to a flawed system that entrenches people with insurmountable debt for trying to get ahead. I support a full cancellation of student debt to provide people across the country with real relief. No one should have to decide between putting food on the table or paying their student loan payment. We must prioritize debt cancellation for the millions of Americans crushed by exorbitant student loans. One fact that I didn't mention in the presentation was that the average payment that people have is $400 a month back in the pockets of 46 million Americans, and that is a stimulus that's definitely worth fighting for. So she's also provided a great one-page explainer on the Student Debt Cancellation Act, which you can read here. I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but if you go to pdamerica.org/Student Debt Cancellation Act, you can read her whole statement here as well. Okay, let me stop share. Okay. Representative Alma Adams is also a great champion of student debt cancellation in the House of Representatives, and she's a co-sponsor of HR 3448. She's also sent the following statement to share with us today. We are battling, this is from Representative Adams after this. We are battling a student loan crisis that existed long before the pandemic paralyzed our economy and threw tens of millions of Americans out of their jobs. Today, more than 44 million Americans owe over $1.6 trillion in student loan debt, and 1 in 4 borrowers are behind on paying back their loans. These borrowers are nurses, teachers, veterans, senior citizens, public servants, and essential workers, simply anyone trying to achieve the American dream by investing in education. Because of crippling debt, student borrowers start families and save for retirement. Student loan debt has surpassed credit cards and auto loans as the largest debt held by consumers, second only to mortgages. Meanwhile, the student loan servicing industry is making $150 billion each year, with $2 billion in commissions, as borrowers fall into delinquency, default, and despair, with no awareness of programs designed to provide relief. We know that many Americans were struggling to repay their student loans before the pandemic, and now it has only gotten worse. The impact is particularly severe for communities of color, rural and low-income communities, veterans and service members, women and older Americans. The domino effect of this debt is devastating, sending a ripple effect through our communities. Although pursuing higher education is still a pathway to higher incomes over a person's lifetime, student loan debt threatens to undermine this promise in North Carolina and nationwide. In our home state, over 1.2 million North Carolinians hold $44 billion in student loan debt. This affects the state's economy as student debtors delay or forego their short and long-term goals out of concern about financial stability. To add insult to injury, key members of this administration have turned their back and walked away from their responsibilities to protect student borrowers and provide critical oversight over the student loan servicing industry. Sadly, student loans are treated unlike any other type of debt in America. There is no regulatory framework, no codified set of minimum standards, and limited consumer protections. Borrowers deserve a Bill of Rights that ensures basic protections, including better access to financial assistance and counseling programs. Far too many student borrowers find themselves fair processing of payments and poorly administered loan forgiveness programs. In 2012, less than 3% of borrowers were taking advantage of the income-based repayment program. Even worse, a government-funded audit found that 70% of federal student loan borrowers that entered into default were in fact eligible for an income-based repayment plan of $0 per month. That is an abysmal failure. It's clear that the status quo is not working. For millions of Americans, a temporary moratorium on federal student loan payments expires in just a few weeks. Borrowers will be forced to restart payments as unemployment stays at record highs and COVID-19 keeps businesses shuttered. Suspending student loan payments alone won't solve this crisis. Addressing our student debt crisis could put money directly into the hands of Americans just when they need it the most. And with student debt held disproportionately by Americans of color, student debt cancellation could help close the racial wealth gap. We must continue to fight to ensure student loan debt does not continue to be a financial sinkhole for millions of Americans who just want to improve themselves and their station in life. So that was Representative Alma Adams from North Carolina and her powerful statement on government action on this crisis. So I've also prepared a quick slide of